June 19, 1940-4, 140 miles northwest of Guam, an unprecedented slaughter unfolded in Pacific skies. LT. Junior grade Alexander V. R. ACU pressed against his F6F Hellcat canopy, staring in disbelief at what lay before him. 50 Japanese dive bombers in tight formation, like a swarm of lost bees, heading straight for Task Force 50-8. In 8 minutes, VRACU shot down 6 enemy aircraft, using only 360 rounds, averaging 60 rounds per kill. When he landed on the USS Lexington, grinning and holding up 6 fingers for photographers, he embodied a brutal reality. Japanese naval commanders were only beginning to grasp that their once-minus elite corps of naval aviators no longer existed. The men who struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision, who drove Allied forces across the Pacific, were gone forever. Japan's naval aviation of 1940-1 and 1940-2 had long since become wreckage beneath the Pacific waves. What remained were mere boys who could barely find their own carriers, flying straight into the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The young pilots diving toward the American fleet that morning had averaged only 200 hours of flight training. By late 1940-4, many of these young pilots would graduate with only about 40 hours of actual flight time. Their American opponents had accumulated over 500 hours of flight experience before ever seeing combat duty. This single numerical disparity would tell the story of June 19, 1940- for better than tactical analysis. Japan's fatal assumption that elite warriors could never be mass-minus collided with American industrial reality. Japan had run out of trained pilots, and everyone who watched the sky that day would witness this devastating fact firsthand. The seeds of this devastating crisis had been planted as early as the pivotal Battle of Midway in 1940-2. On June 4, 1940-2, 4 Japanese fleet carriers sank to the bottom of the Pacific at the Battle of Midway. In a single devastating day at Midway, Japan lost 110 of its most experienced and irreplaceable combat pilots. These were not rookies fresh from training schools, but the elite of the elite, carefully cultivated over many long years. Each loss represented irreplaceable combat experience and a deep, hard-1 understanding of complex carrier operations. Midway was not the end but the beginning of Japan's pilot crisis, a downward spiral that would only accelerate. The Solomon Islands campaign from August 1940- to February 1940- consumed veteran pilots. Air battles over Rabaul, Santa Cruz, Bougainville, each engagement chipped away at the core of Japanese naval aviation. By the end of 1940-3, Japan had lost roughly 70% of the pilots who had flown at Pearl Harbor. Aces who once swept across Pacific skies in Zero fighters were now dead, exhausted, or too wounded for combat missions. Japanese naval aviation went from a force that commanded the world's respect to nothing more than an empty shell. Yet Japan did not adjust its strategy to address this crisis, choosing instead to deny reality and press forward blindly. Japan's naval pilot training system was among the most rigorous in the entire world during the early war years. Pre-war pilot training courses lasted years with extremely high attrition rates, and only the very best graduated. This system produced pilots of astonishing quality, but in extremely limited numbers, unable to sustain a prolonged war. When wartime attrition began exceeding training output, Japan faced a fundamental and fateful choice about its future. Either lower standards to quickly produce more pilots, or keep the elite approach and hope quality offsets quantity. Japan chose the latter, and it was a fatal mistake that would seal the fate of its naval aviation in the Pacific War. America made the exact opposite choice after Pearl Harbor, committing to a strategy of overwhelming numerical advantage. Naval aviation launched a massive training program, transforming thousands of civilians into qualified naval pilots. Training courses were standardized and systematic, capable of being conducted simultaneously at bases across the country. America did not need every pilot to be an ace, just competent enough to do the job and return to fight another day. Quantity itself creates quality. When pilots outnumber the enemy 10-1, the cumulative advantage is overwhelming. By 1940-4, the U.S. Navy training system was producing over 1,000 qualified naval pilots per month. Japan during the same period could train fewer than 100 pilots monthly, a gap that sealed its fate in the skies. This 10-to-1 ratio extended far beyond training output alone. It permeated the entire war system from top to bottom. From carrier construction to aircraft production, fuel to ammunition, every aspect saw America overwhelming Japan by similar proportions. Grumman specifically designed the F6F Hellcat fighter to counter the Zero, creating a purpose-built aerial predator for the Pacific. The Hellcat was faster, tougher, and more heavily armed than the Zero, capable of dominating even in low-speed dogfight combat. American pilots no longer had to face superior enemy aircraft with inferior equipment as they had in the desperate early war. They now flew devastating killing machines purpose-built to defeat their opponents, machines that turned the tide of aerial warfare. When these two fundamentally different systems collided on June 19, 1940-4, the outcome was almost predetermined. But predetermined did not mean it was not devastating, for the sheer scale of destruction that followed would shock the world. The prelude to the Battle of the Philippine Sea began on June 11th when the U.S. Fifth Fleet launched air strikes against the Marianas. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, these three islands were critical key nodes in Japan's inner defense perimeter across the Pacific. Capturing the Marianas meant B-20-9 bombers could strike the Japanese mainland directly from these newly captured bases. The Japanese Navy understood this grave threat and was determined to defend the Marianas at all costs, whatever the sacrifice required. The Japanese Combined Fleet devised Operation A-Go, a do-or battle plan that would determine the fate of the entire Pacific War. The core concept was coordinated attacks from carrier and land-based aircraft, striking American carrier groups from multiple directions simultaneously. If successful, the American fleet would be forced to withdraw from Marianas waters, and Japan's inner defense perimeter could be preserved. But this plan was built on a fundamentally flawed assumption that Japanese pilots were capable of executing such complex, coordinated attacks. On June 18th, the Japanese First Mobile Fleet under Vice Admiral Ozawa sailed into the Philippine Sea, ready for confrontation. Ozawa commanded 9 carriers carrying approximately 450 aircraft, a force that appeared formidable on paper at least. On paper, this was still a formidable force, but the paper figures concealed a fatal weakness that would soon be exposed in battle. The pilots aboard these aircraft mostly possessed only the most basic flying skills, utterly incapable of surviving intense aerial combat. Ozawa's decision to launch attacks from extreme range actually exposed his blind faith in his pilots' capabilities. Japanese carriers could theoretically strike from vast distances that American carriers simply could not match. The Zero's range allowed attacks from greater distances, but without trained pilots, this advantage was meaningless. On the morning of June 19, 1940-4, the first Japanese attack wave launched from the carriers. Approximately 70 aircraft headed toward the American fleet in the first strike of that fateful June morning. American radar detected this incoming raid at a distance of over 100 miles, giving defenders ample warning. Fighter directors quickly sectored Hellcat fighters to optimal intercept positions well before the enemy arrived. When Japanese pilots sighted the American fleet, they faced not defenseless targets, but a wall of Hellcat fighters. VRAC and his comrades dove from above, like hawks, upon helpless prey, their guns blazing with devastating effect. The first wave was shattered in mere minutes, with most aircraft shot down before approaching the American carriers. Survivors turned and fled, with more aircraft lost on the return flight due to fuel, exhaustion, or disorientation. The second wave met the same fate as over 100 Japanese aircraft again launched from extreme range. They were again detected early by American radar and once more intercepted by swarms of deadly Hellcat fighters. The few that broke through the interceptor screen faced the American fleet's dense and withering anti-mine aircraft fire. Not a single Japanese aircraft managed to score a hit on an American carrier throughout the entire day's engagement. The third wave could not even find the American fleet, as pilots became hopelessly disoriented over the vast Pacific. In the confusion, some aircraft mistakenly attacked other Japanese ships, believing them to be American vessels. In a tragic irony, some Japanese planes were even shot down by their own side's anti-mine aircraft fire amid the chaos. Throughout the morning, Japan launched over 300 sorties but caused virtually no damage to the American fleet. American losses were negligible, while Japan lost over 200 aircraft and large numbers of irreplaceable pilots. The slaughter was so overwhelmingly one-sided that American pilots began calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. This was not combat in any traditional sense of the word. It was hunting, pure and simple, a truly devastating pursuit. Meanwhile, American submarines were creating devastation beneath the waves, silently stalking their targets through the deep. On the morning of June 19, 1940-4, the American submarine Albacore spotted the Japanese carrier Taiho. Taiho was Japan's newest and most advanced fleet carrier, displacing 30-4,000 tons with an armored flight deck. But one single torpedo was enough to change everything, proving even the mightiest warships carried fatal vulnerabilities. The torpedo fired by Albacore struck Taiho's starboard side with tremendous force, and the initial damage appeared non-fatal. But the torpedo had ruptured aviation fuel tanks below deck, and volatile gas began spreading throughout the ship's interior. Damage control teams failed to address this threat in time, and Taiho's enclosed hangar design allowed the gas to accumulate. About 6 hours later, a catastrophic explosion tore the 30-1,000 vessel to pieces. Taiho sank within minutes, taking 1,650 crew members with her to the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Almost simultaneously, another American submarine, Naval, found its prey in the Japanese carrier S.H. Shokaku lurking nearby. S.H. Shokaku was a veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack, one of the most experienced carriers in the entire Japanese Navy. 3 of Naval's 6 torpedoes struck home, and S.H. Shokaku struggled through explosions and fires for hours before sinking. 1,260-3 crew members went down with S.H. Shokaku to the cold, dark bottom of the vast Pacific Ocean. In a single devastating day, Japan lost 2 large carriers, while the American fleet suffered virtually no damage whatsoever. On June 20, 1940-4, Spruance ordered a pursuit of the retreating Japanese fleet across the open ocean. American pilots launched daring attacks at dusk, sinking the light carrier Taiho and heavily damaging 2 more enemy carriers. But this pursuit also came at a cost. Many American aircraft ran out of fuel during the night, returned and ditched at sea. Nevertheless, the outcome of the Battle of the Philippine Sea was beyond any doubt a truly decisive American victory. Japan lost 3 carriers, over 600 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 sailors across 2 days. America lost 130 aircraft, mostly from nighttime landing accidents, and not a single carrier was sunk. This battle was not merely a military defeat, but the definitive epitome of an entire system's catastrophic collapse. Japanese naval aviation, once the pride of the fleet, effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force after this battle. The surviving pilots and remaining aircraft are too few to constitute any kind of effective fighting force. From the Philippine Sea until the war's end, Japan could never again mount any meaningful naval challenge at sea. The root of this tragedy was not any single error, but rather the steady accumulation of deeply systemic failures. Japan's training system could not produce nearly enough qualified pilots to sustain operations under wartime conditions. Japan's industrial base could not manufacture enough advanced aircraft to adequately replace its combat losses. Japan's fuel supply was severed by American submarines, making even the most basic training flights impossible. Japan's radar and communications technology was outdated, rendering it unable to effectively direct aerial combat. Japan's strategic thinking remained stuck in the era of decisive single battles, unable to adapt to modern warfare. These failures were not accidental at all. They were the inevitable result of Japan's entire national strategy. A resource-limited island nation waging war against a superpower 10 times its industrial might was a massive gamble. Japan's early victories gave its leaders the dangerous illusion that they could simply keep winning indefinitely. When America began converting its vast industrial capacity to war production, Japan had absolutely no response. By 1940-4, the United States was producing more than 5 times as many aircraft annually as Japan. American shipyards launched a new carrier every few months, while Japan built only a handful throughout the entire war. American pilot training schools spanned the nation, while Japan's training facilities halted due to fuel shortages. VRACU's famous photo, holding up 6 fingers and grinning widely, captured the essence of the American war effort. VRACU was proud, and rightly so. Shooting down 6 planes in 8 minutes demanded exceptional skill and courage. But his grin was not cruel mockery of defeated enemies, for it reflected something far more genuinely human and honest. It was the grin of a young man who had done his job well, who had protected his carrier and his shipmates with honor. He had survived combat and would live to fight another day, returning to his carrier with the satisfaction of duty done. The photograph showed confidence without arrogance, skill without cruelty, victory without hatred, a portrait of honor. That image, more than any tactical analysis or statistical summary, explains why America won the Pacific War decisively. American forces were confident because they had reason for confidence, built on training, equipment, and industrial might. They were backed by industrial capacity Japan could not match, trained by programs designed to produce competent pilots. They were equipped with aircraft and weapons that gave them significant advantages over their opponents in combat. They fought not from desperation or fanaticism, but from professional competence backed by overwhelming force. Spruance's Fifth Fleet maintained clear strategic priorities throughout the battle, never deviating from its mission. Protect the invasion forces at Saipan, destroy Japanese naval air power, and if opportunity permitted, sink Japanese carriers. Spruance never deviated from these priorities, even when tactical opportunities tempted more aggressive action. His decision not to pursue the enemy fleet on the night of June 19th frustrated some subordinates. Spruance understood his primary mission was protecting amphibious forces, not chasing enemy carriers into darkness. By contrast, Japan's planning reflected the belief that one decisive battle could reverse the war's momentum entirely. Operation A-Go assumed carriers and land-based planes could strike simultaneously from many directions. Resulting damage might force an American withdrawal from the Marianas, but the plan required precise coordination. It required pilots capable of pressing attacks through heavy opposition, and on June 19th, none existed. Launching strikes from extreme range reflected overconfidence in the capabilities of their remaining pilots. Japanese carriers could theoretically strike from distances American carriers could not match because the Zero's superior range allowed attacks from greater distances. But range advantage meant nothing when pilots could not execute effective attacks even after reaching their targets. Japanese aircraft launched from extreme range, flew for hours over open ocean, and then had to return across hundreds of miles to carriers that might have moved. This operational profile demanded navigation skills, fuel management discipline, and tactical judgment that inadequately trained pilots simply did not possess. Many Japanese aircraft that survived the attacks were lost on the return flight when pilots became disoriented or ran out of fuel. American carrier doctrine emphasized shorter, range strikes with aircraft having adequate fuel reserves for combat and safe return. American pilots knew they could reach their carriers after combat because operations kept strike ranges within conservative limits. American pilots could return to their carriers after combat, refuel and rearm, and launch again. Japanese pilots often lacked sufficient fuel for extended combat or safe return after their attacks. This contrast in fuel discipline was stark on June 19th. America's technological advantages extended into the electronic warfare domain as well. American radar could detect incoming raids at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Fighter directors could vector interceptors to precise positions using radar tracking. Communications networks connected carriers, fighter directors and pilots, ships and aircraft, forming an efficient combat command system. Japanese radar technology existed, but was far from achieving the level of operational integration that America had accomplished. The core of the technological gap was not about the superiority of individual pieces of equipment. It was about the infrastructure and training that allowed technology to be used effectively. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not America's most important naval battle. Midway probably deserves that distinction for stopping Japanese expansion and shifting the war's momentum. But the Turkey Shoot was the most one-sided demonstration of American superiority. It was the clearest proof that Japan had lost the capacity to contest American advances and the mathematical confirmation that continuing the war was futile. The Battle of the Philippine Sea proved that modern warfare rewards the nation that can train adequate warriors by the thousands over the nation that trains elite warriors by the dozens. Japan built its strategy around quality, around the decisive battle where superior skill would triumph. America built its strategy around quantity, around the long war where superior industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm any opponent. June 19, 1940 demonstrated which strategy matched the reality of industrial-age warfare. Japan's military leadership assumed that spirit could overcome material, that courage could defeat production capacity. These assumptions were rooted in centuries of samurai tradition and recent successes in China and early Pacific campaigns. But in the context of total industrial war between major powers, these assumptions were fundamentally wrong. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot demonstrated this reality with mathematical precision. American industrial capacity applied methodically to training and production created military capabilities that Japanese courage and skill could not match. The battle's significance extended far beyond immediate tactical results. It demonstrated to Japanese leadership that continuing the war was futile. American carrier forces could operate with impunity across the Pacific. American air power would soon devastate Japanese cities, and American submarines had already crippled Japanese merchant shipping. The industrial gap between the United States and Japan, always vast, had become an unbridgeable chasm. Every month the war continued would see American advantages increase while Japanese capabilities decreased. Yet the war would continue for another 14 months after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japanese leadership, unable to accept the implications of their defeat, would commit the nation to a defense costing hundreds of thousands of lives. The tragedy of the Battle of the Philippine Sea was not just the immediate casualties, but the clear demonstration that those casualties achieved nothing. Japan did not save Saipan, did not stop American advances, and did not buy time to negotiate better peace terms. The sacrifice of over 600 aircraft and 3,000 sailors accomplished nothing except proving Japan had lost the capacity for modern naval warfare. For students of military history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea offers clear lessons about what determines victory in modern warfare. Training matters more than individual courage, and industrial capacity matters more than martial tradition. Technological advantages matter more than fighting spirit, and integrated operations matter more than isolated excellence. Nations that understand these factors and organize their societies to maximize these advantages will prevail in modern warfare. Nations that rely on courage, individual skill, or spirit to overcome material disadvantages will lose. The lesson is clear, the evidence is overwhelming, and the results are decisive. The young men who fought on June 19, 1940, were paid with their lives to teach these lessons. Japanese pilots died because their nation's leaders had made strategic errors years before the battle, while American pilots survived because their nation made better choices. The difference was not courage or skill or dedication, but strategic vision, industrial capacity, and the ability to organize society for total war. These factors, not individual heroism, determine the battle's outcome in the course of the Pacific War. The lesson is harsh but clear. Modern warfare rewards nations that understand industrial-age realities and punishes nations that cling to pre-industrial assumptions. The influence of the Battle of the Philippine Sea extended far beyond World War II itself, establishing principles that would govern naval aviation for decades. Comprehensive training programs became standard in all modern navies, and mass production of reliable aircraft replaced orders on production of theoretically superior designs. Integrated operations combining multiple capabilities became doctrine, and the lessons of June 19, 1940 were studied worldwide. The battle became a classic case study in how industrial powers wage modern warfare, and how nations that fail to adapt face inevitable defeat. Great Marianas Turkey Shoot proved this reality beyond any doubt, a verdict written in the skies over the Philippine Sea. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history's most decisive battles, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. I am your military history analyst, and I will see you on the next battlefield where history was made.